Welcome. My name is Ashley Rose Young, and I'm the historian for the American Food History Project at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. I want to begin by saying that I'm here in Washington, D.C., on the native lands of the Nacastine, Piscataway, and Pamunkey tribes. Wherever we are, let us acknowledge and give our respect to Native peoples for the opportunity to work and live in their territories. Here at the museum, the American Food History Project invites the broader public to join the conversation about food history and why it matters through research, collections, exhibitions, and programs like today's event, Recovering Food Histories with Toni Tipton-Martin and Friends. During this program, Toni Tipton-Martin, journalist, cookbook author, editor, television host, mentor, community advocate, and recipient of the 2021 Julia Child Award, will host a virtual salon. Today, she is convening a panel of trailblazing women to talk about the role of research and archives in recovering and enriching historical narratives around food history. Their discussion will explore the essential acts of primary research, writing, mentorship, and public outreach. Toni will kick off the event with award-winning journalist and biographer Alelia Bundles. Together, they are going to share new perspectives on Bundles' great-great-grandmother, Madam C.J. Walker, the noted Black entrepreneur, philanthropist, and activist, as well as Alelia's great-grandmother and namesake, Alelia Walker, who is known for hosting elaborate and fanciful salons in Harlem. Through their careful research in the Madam Walker family archives, a new understanding of Walker's intellectual salons hosted in her home has emerged. Honoring the tradition of Walker's salons, the event will continue with Toni welcoming New York Times bestselling author, host, and executive producer Padma Lakshmi, and journalist, food historian, and cookbook author Sandra Gutierrez. Together, they will speak candidly and share their experiences as women and women of color navigating the world of food writing and beyond. At the heart of today's event lies a message about the role women play as researchers, writers, and keepers of their communities' histories. The critical role of women's networks in facing challenges and barriers, as well as in mentoring future generations, and the inspiring ways in which women can support each other in personal and professional realms. Let's get started.
Well, it is such a pleasure to have you here tonight. Welcome, Alelia. I'm just so glad you're here. I'm so glad that you're joining me to share some of your experiences researching and writing with accuracy about your great-great and your great-grandmother, right? Did I get that right? The
Absolutely.
two of them, Madam C.J. Walker and Alelia Walker, two really important African-American women in the face of published misrepresentation. I'm just really thrilled that we're here together. It might interest our audience to know how we came together, to know that when I was working on the Jemima Code, I was looking for a big personality, an African-American woman that had some level of food in her background in order to try to dismantle the other big glaring image in our world, the Aunt Jemima character. And so Madam C.J. Walker was a natural attraction to me, and I was just hopeful that I would find something in her background about food. And I was stunned to encounter an exhibit at the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library in Denver that spoke about her being a cook. And I guess I shouldn't have been really surprised about that, given that her hair products were concoctions that are, cooked and created in the kitchen. But we can talk about that later. The other thing I want to just share is how we came to talk further, not just about Madam and her beginnings with some aspects of cooking, but also to talk about the significance and the misrepresentation of her daughter Alelia's salons that were held in Harlem. I reached out to you, as you recall, to find out if what I was reading was true. I just simply was a curious journalist thinking that what I was reading about her in some cases seemed almost perverted. And I wanted a greater picture of her and the importance of the salon as an act of subversion and a way to lift up the culture. So I want us to talk about those two things tonight, how we came together and about the work that you've been doing to preserve, celebrate, and to honor both of their contributions beyond the products that we know them for.
Well, Toni, first of all, congratulations. I am so thrilled for you and for all of the things at the Smithsonian that you've been doing, and just delighted to be here in conversation with you. And we both have journalism backgrounds. And so I think that we are women who care about facts.
Right.
And often know that the facts are so much more interesting than the things that people think they have to make up about these people. So I am always happy to talk about both Madam Walker, my great-great-grandmother, and Alelia Walker, my great-grandmother and namesake, and to really go through the various dimensions of their lives. As you said, you discovered Madam Walker was a cook before she was a millionaire entrepreneur and businesswoman. And she had a speech that she made in 1912. She was at the National Negro Business League convention, and Booker T. Washington was not giving her an opportunity to speak. But she presented to him the journey, the arc of a life that had been true for many Black women. And she stood up when he wouldn't let her speak. And she said, surely you're not going to shut the door in my face. I'm a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the wash tub. From there, I was promoted to the kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. I have built my own factory on my own ground. And when she had her first convention of her sales agents in 1917, 200 women who came from all over the United States and the Caribbean, among the women in that group were women who'd been sharecroppers, who'd been cooks, who'd been laundresses. And so she knew their journey, but she was offering them something else.
That is so important to share, to have people understand that there is a transition. And sometimes we don't know where these experiences will take us, but she stood up for herself. And I love that. That you've been pursuing that. Well, so tell us a little bit about your research into them. I'm certain people will think, well, of course, she's been able to do the research as part of her family. But as you mentioned, you are a journalist, an award-winning journalist in your own right. And I'm wondering what it takes for us and for others to make a significant contribution to the collective knowledge of food and history. How can people get started in this work?
I think that it's key to understand that the last thing I thought I would be doing is telling Madam Walker's story. I was interested in becoming a writer. I started writing at 8 years old. I went through, high school and college, working on the school newspaper and the radio station. And when I got to graduate school in journalism at Columbia University, the only Black woman on the faculty, Phyllis Garland, was my advisor for my master's paper. I gave her a bunch of topics. And at the end of the conversation, she said, your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker? So, so I'm like, yes, that's my family. She said, that's what you're going to write about. That was 1975. And it was really Phyllis, whose mother had been editor of the Pittsburgh Courier. She herself had been a journalist. She understood the power of the story, even when I didn't understand the power of that story. Both of my parents worked in hair care. My mother was vice president of the Walker Company, but that was absolutely the last thing I was interested in doing. So I was introduced to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker in some ways around the dinner table. Not that we talked about them, but the silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram. The china that we used for special occasions had belonged to Madam Walker, had been in her mansion at Villa Lawaro in Irvington, New York. And we had this big sterling silver punch bowl that my mother made eggnog in every Christmas. So I learned about them in that way, just sort of the examples, little artifacts of their lives. And then fast forward, many years later, I began to truly do the research. Now, we're fortunate that we have literally tens of thousands of documents. Most people don't have that, but there is all kinds of information in newspapers and then family oral history, family stories. So that's how I started, just sort of with the silverware, with the monogram silverware. That was my clue. And then it blossomed into really digging more deeply into what their lives were like and getting beyond the myth.
It's so interesting that we also share the same beginning, that I was not interested in being a food writer. I wanted to be a hard news reporter because I was interested primarily in the facts. And I thought that the pursuit of creative writing, of soft news, of feature stories was not going to be meaty enough for me. Like I really wanted to solve or save people, somewhere deep in my spirit. I think that was always there. And there was a similar single moment that just triggered for me this desire to unravel a story based on, in some ways, there were some pieces of my own personal family history, as you said, starting with the punch bowl or the silverware. But then as journalists, we're taught to not be part of the story. And so I'm thinking about how you had this access to all of this archival at home and in your family, but your journalistic instincts would probably kick in at some point and cause you to think more about external research. So to summarize all of that, I guess my question is, On Her Own Ground is a dense, factually dense book. I loved reading the ways that you interweave the family archival assets that you have and then transition to putting her story into context and even making some guesses. You were able to see the journalism work at hand. So can you tell us a little bit about how you used existing archives that are beyond your family, as well as those kernels that perhaps led you beyond your own family story?
Sure. So I start with literally the paragraphs worth of information that my family knew, that Madam Walker was born in Delta, Louisiana in 1867 on the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. First child in her family born free, orphaned at 7, married at 14. She said to get a home of her own to escape a cruel brother-in-law, a mother at 17, and then a widow at 20. She moved up the river from Louisiana, Mississippi, Delta, Louisiana, and Vicksburg, Mississippi are right across the river from each other. So really the same town. Then moved to St. Louis in the late 1880s, where her older brothers had migrated a decade earlier. They were barbers. She became a member of St. Paul AME Church, and it was the women of the church who took her under their wing and began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. So that was kind of the story that was in the corporate bio in a sense. But I then began to, as I seriously began to do the research, I interviewed the few people who were still living, who had known Madam Walker and Alelia Walker, and there were just a few, but her secretary, who had gone to work in 1914, was still working for the Walker Company in the 70s. So she was one of my key sources. My grandfather was also very helpful, but I had that kernel with oral history and then this great body of letters, but I expanded that into archives in probably a dozen different cities, whether at that point it was microfilm and Black newspapers, where you had to go to Chicago to see the Chicago Defender versus now when you can read it on newspapers.com. I went through historical societies in different cities where they lived, the personal papers of people they'd known, like Booker T. Washington or Mary McLeod Bethune. but just really combing through and finding those little gems and little tidbits that helped me create a much more multidimensional story about Madam Walker. Because, you know, what most people knew about Madam Walker is that she did something with hair care products, and that was kind of the extent. But then to discover that she was a philanthropist who supported Black artists and musicians and Black schools, that she was a political activist who supported the anti-lynching movement, and all of those things made her, for me, a much more interesting person than just she made hair care products.
I love that. And that is certainly also part of what drew me to her story, was learning about all of the ways that she reached out beyond the business and the entrepreneurship, which is, of course, important. We want to recognize her accomplishments because they were significant. But it's this idea that in the midst of all of the struggle and all of that hard work, that these women like her, but we're talking about her, found a way to give back and to convey their passions to the next generation. So let's segue a little bit and talk about that next generation, your great grandmother and Alelia. So I'm in the midst of writing a cocktail book. And I had told you I had this wild hair about wanting to know more about the Walker family. And then I watched the series that was on Netflix. And I was eagerly watching every frame for these references that I had read in documents about bootleg champagne. Because as many people know, the difference between what my work does in Jubilee and in the Jemima Code is tries to tell a broader story of who we are by looking at more of people beyond the working class, the agricultural migrants from the South. And so I had heard about juke joints and researched a lot about what was happening in the agricultural South, but I wanted to know more about what was happening in the cities. So I've been chasing down bartenders and caterers and looking for menus. And so, of course, that led me to these stories about the champagne. And when I got to the series, I was so disappointed that because of the representation of the parties. And it took a little bit further digging. As you said, you have to look in so many sources, you have to do so much cross-referencing and looking in unusual places, as you mentioned, letters, to try and find a little bit more truth. So can you tell us about what it was that Alelia undertook in Harlem when she was given more responsibility for the business, and how she took on the idea of uplifting the community?
Absolutely. So, you know, the Netflix series Self-Made, I always have to say Octavia Spencer was amazing, but there was a lot that I did not like about it, to just be really honest and frank. Yeah. I just thought that there were so many missed opportunities about that generation of people like Madam Walker, first generation out of slavery, her daughter sort of then moving from the rural areas to the city, and what that generation was doing as they were emerging and creating institutions and sort of making something new, the new Negro, literally. Right. And so that was key for me. And I just thought, you know, it just missed the mark on doing that. But when I really examined Alelia Walker and what she did during the 1920s, she was very famous for what was called the Dark Tower, a salon in her home, a tea room, they called it. Of course, it was during Prohibition, so you could call it a tea room, you know, and not a club. But she was known for that because it brought together folks from Greenwich Village, folks from downtown, the white artists and musicians and socialites, and African Americans who were part of the social world and who were part of the cultural world. And her place was a place where people were very comfortable mingling. But this sense of entertaining, I really think she began to learn from her mother. So Madam Walker had been a cook for a pharmacist in Denver. And with many African Americans, people had catered. They knew they were the ones who were serving these fine dinners, as we know, all the way back to Jefferson and Washington. They were creating the menus. She was hiring Black caterers. So there's a party that Alelia Walker hosted for Madam Walker in 1914 in Harlem, right after Alelia Walker had moved to Harlem, and it was catered by a Black caterer who often did dinners for hostesses on Fifth Avenue. There was always live music. Both women loved music. They had been exposed to music even when they were poor and living in St. Louis. Ragtime was happening. The German musicians, their church had a Kilgan organ, which was state of the art, everything. Their choir director was a classically trained opera tenor, so they knew about music. They always wanted to have live music. So this party in New York was kind of Madam Walker's introduction to the city. Then she hosted a musical, a spring musicale for Alelia in Indianapolis in April of 1914. And Noble Sissel, whose name we know because of Sissel and Blake, was a young, talented musician who was the featured musician at that dance. So and they always printed their menus. So fast forward, this seed had been planted even in St. Louis when they were poor. Then they began, once they had some money, they began to entertain. And then as they moved through each year, there were more elaborate parties. Once Madam Walker built Villa Lawaro, her mansion in Irvington, New York, the parties got bigger. They got more elaborate. With live music, with orchestras, with fancy food, and then many, many more parties through the decades. But I would say the culmination, at least, and certainly in the imagination of what the Harlem Renaissance was about, was Alelia Walker's fabulous parties at Villa Lawaro, her weekend-long parties with great menus, and the Dark Tower in Harlem on 136th Street.
Well, you haven't quite given away my whole book, but so thank you for that. I was, as we had this conversation, and I asked you, were there any written menus, anything that I could see as facts to contradict the stories that we are experiencing cocktails and bartending and libations, was limited to making bathtub gin during rent parties. And so you started to tell me a little bit about some work that you're working on now to further expose more about the family and this idea of the parties and the menus. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I do have a fair amount of menus. I mean, you've seen this. I'm just going to hold this up, but this is
That's the one you sent to me.
The menu from the Dark Tower, and it has vegetable soup and cold cuts, lettuce and tomatoes, hot dogs and potato salad, sort of a wide range of things, Limburger cheese. And there's also Alelia Walker iced tea. So I have to say it was prohibition. So I just always guessed that maybe that meant you could put whatever you'd like into your drink. But the idea of, bathtub gin or, homemade champagne, Alelia Walker was, she lived really well. She had a private bootlegger. I mean, when she was having a party, there was a guy named McCleary Stinnett, who was said to be her, personal bootlegger. And most people who had some means had somebody who was supplying something. People were bringing stuff from Canada and, getting things in when she would have a party. So she was serving the finest alcohol. I have two flasks and decanters with her monogram on them. So I know, and one has a key so she could lock it up. So I know that she was serving the best that she could have. And she loved champagne. That was her favorite drink. Now, the story that has been repeated over and over again when many people write about the Harlem Renaissance and when they mention her, to me is an entirely made up story, but it's kind of a dramatic story. So I think it's just too tempting for people who haven't done their original research. And this is what you and I talk about a lot. People just kind of repeat the same error and myth over and over again. But there's supposedly was a party where Alelia Walker served her white guests pig's feet and bathtub gin and her Black guests caviar and champagne. I can find no, primary source that says that. And it just really doesn't seem to me, the more that when you're doing a biography on somebody, you're really digging deeply and you get to know who they are. And it just really didn't fit, because I don't think she would want to serve her white guest anything less than the best. She was trying to make a point about who she was.
Absolutely. That does not make any sense to me either, but there are these myths that persist as they relate to our culture. Can you tell me a little bit about how you did set these stories in context? What's the role of historical societies, archives, museums, libraries, since we are here at the Smithsonian and we have both benefited from the vast research that's out there? Can you tell us a little bit about how you use those sources?
Oh boy, libraries and historical societies and museums are my friend. I am a person who loves the mildew and the dust of the archives.
Me too.
Because you find so much. Listen, just recently, I was in Indianapolis, which is where the bulk of the Madam Walker collection is at the Indiana Historical Society. And that, I was deeply researching something in 1927. And I found a letter. I don't know if I'd seen this. I don't think I'd ever seen it, but it was a letter, a really detailed letter where Alelia Walker is writing to the hostess at the Dark Tower and giving her a menu, giving her a recipe for Brunswick stew. So, there's always some other little deep piece of information that's still available. But people have, through the years, as they've donated their papers, donated artifacts to these various museums and manuscript collections, have really created a map for all of us who want to tell the story. But it does take some work. Mm-hmm. You can't always believe the first thing that you see. Primary sources are so important. But I really believe that it's primary sources that allow us to tell the true story of these ancestors. And I think they deserve it. I really, I feel very, I don't know, emotional. I feel very committed. I feel very devoted to making sure that I get it right, because they went through so much. And for us to not represent them properly, I just, is something I would never do.
It speaks so highly of who you are as a professional, and not just as a family member, right? But this is part of our professional calling, is to tell the truth to the extent that we can do that. And so what I'd love for us to leave our viewers with is the idea that everyone can serve in this type of correspondence capacity. The libraries, the historical societies, these files are deep and rich. And it begins with a personal trigger, like some curiosity. And so can you wrap us up with, tell us a fun bit of serendipity that you've encountered. You just shared a little bit about this letter and the menu. Tell us something else that's been fun for you to encounter and how that may be shaping where you're headed with your new project.
One of the things that is a gift for me during the early 1980s, when I was really starting to seriously do the research for what became my books, I spent a summer in New York. And at that point, a lot of the Harlem Renaissance folks were still living, or enough of them were still living. Alberta Hunter, the blues singer who was singing at the Cookery. Geraldine Dismond, later known as Jerry Major, who was the society columnist for Jet, had been the society columnist for Black newspapers during the 1920s and 30s. Romery Bearden, the artist, whose mother, Bessie, had been a good friend of Alelia Walker's. She'd been a society columnist. So it was as if I had a dance card. And one of them, I would meet one, I would interview one, and then they would call the other one and say, Alelia Walker's great-granddaughter is here doing research this summer. And then they just one after the other introduced me. So that by the end of the summer, I had a picture of my great-great-grandmother that I never would have had, but for these amazing 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds who just were so generous with me.
We love them, don't we?
Absolutely.
They are my heart and soul as well. Alelia, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation for what I hope will be more of these to come. where we can just talk a little bit about what we do and how we can encourage others to do more to unearth the true stories of our ancestors and share them with the world. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And again, congratulations.
Thank you. Well, it is a continuation of the joy that I'm having tonight to be able to introduce two of my friends, my colleagues, well-respected women in their own right, who are not only carrying the baton for their communities, but also inspiring other women in particular to do the same. And that's what we're here really to talk about. Sandra Gutierrez is here. Tonight we are actually fulfilling an ambition that started in somebody's hotel room after an IACP conference. We were all in our jammies and this group grew. One woman told another woman and told another woman, and remember that old commercial? And she told her friends, and so on and so on. And before we knew it, we had a room full of women strategizing about how we can lift one another up in this industry, despite the barriers that we encounter as women of color. And so I'm just thrilled that you're here with me, Sandra, to have some of this conversation outside of our jammies and for others to hear. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on this great award. You so deserve it, and I'm so happy for you.
Thank you so, so much. And of course, Padma, we are more recent friends, but I have to say that the embrace that you gave to me on the set of Top Chef was so important. I was so terrified when I was invited to be there, and you reached over, you shared your glow, which is not usual. You know, you were this beautiful star, and yet you made sure that I felt welcomed and comfortable. You even shared your color of lipstick. You may have forgotten that, but I leaned over at one point and said, "What is that color? It's gorgeous." But beyond that, you whispered a couple of things to me about your struggles, the obstacles that you've overcome to achieve at this level. And I think with social media, it's so easy for people to see us achieving and think it comes easily. It doesn't. And especially as women of color, we have that extra mile to walk. But I think what all three of us share is the desire to not only push through that and do the best that we can professionally, but also to share and uplift the next generation, which Padma, you're doing now with children's books and your relationship that you share with Little Hands. So I am just thrilled to have both of you here as we start to turn my nonprofit towards building a legacy for women to empower the next generation. So thank you both for being here.
Well, first of all, Toni, thank you for asking me. I'm hugely flattered to be in the company that I'm in, and also, of course, to be doing this for the Smithsonian, but also to celebrate you. I have been such an admirer of your writing and of your scholarship, frankly, and I'm just I covet your books. They have a pride of place. I admire everything you've done. I don't think this award could go to a better recipient. So congratulations on your Julia Child Award. I mean, it is so well deserved, and I'm clapping and rooting for you constantly from my corner of the universe, because I know that we'll all benefit from your scholarship. So thanks for having me here today. And it's wonderful to meet you as well, Sandra.
Wonderful to meet you too, Padma. I'm a great fan.
Thank you.
How fun. Padma, you've kind of opened the door with talking about scholarship. I think it was easier for me, even though it was very difficult. The fact that I was rooting my story in the story of others. But your work is hugely personal. Can you tell us a little bit about what it has taken for you to reach the acclaim that you have, not limiting not focused so much on Top Chef and the celebrity of that, but really on your commitment to your writing and what you've accomplished there.
Thank you. I consider myself a writer first. I was just, and in fact, I took Top Chef because I thought it would be a nice little boost for my cookbook that was coming out. I never thought that Top Chef would become this huge, pop culture thing that it has become. But, I think my writing has always been very personal because I am not a journalist by trade, and I have huge respect for journalists. And in fact, I was riveted listening to your conversation earlier, of course, and how you also wanted to be, a hard-nosed, quote unquote, journalist, hard and serious news, but I didn't come to it from a journalism background. I mean, I did. I wrote about food for the New York Times Syndicate. I wrote about fashion for Harper's Bazaar, but I never thought of myself as a journalist. I approached it just through loving books and loving food writing. And, really, one of the greatest writers that has inspired me has always been MFK Fisher. But I'm also a history buff. And so I think that's why I'm so attracted to your work, because it paints this beautifully deep picture through food, but through so much more. And, for a long time, because I didn't go to culinary school and because I am not a trained chef, or have I ever worked the line at a restaurant, frankly, nor do I want to, P.S. I have great respect for that work, but it's not my work. My work is standing in the kitchen of my own home or other people's homes. It's not, selling food like a chef. That's a different skill. But I do think that because of my imposter syndrome, frankly, when I first got to Top Chef, and before that, I was just sort of, trying to explain the recipes that were in my cookbooks and give context to them, because I felt like the body of food knowledge that I had was so idiosyncratic because of my life in two cultures growing up, and also living in Europe for most of my 20s. So at first, my writing about food was just a way to explain the recipes I was trying to teach other people how to make and where they came from and why. And then when I got to Top Chef, I had a huge amount of imposter syndrome, which nobody really dissuaded me from having, because all the people who were on my show as guests or sitting to the left and right of me were mostly white male professional chefs. Who, kind of looked at me like, well, what is this home cook doing here? And, all of that. And so I just started leaning into what I was sure of and what I did know, which was a lot of the personal things. And I wound up, really digging back in my own upbringing and in my own just my own body of knowledge of food. Where did that come from? And of course, it came for me from the women around me and the women in my family, because I think that women always are the keepers in a way. At least for me, that was true of kitchen wisdom and kitchen knowledge. And it is, home cooking or home food, which is I would say, my playing field more than, professional restaurant food, whatever that means. But, I started relying on that. And that's when I found success. It was when I got deeply specific about my own experience and where that knowledge came from, and honoring the sources of that knowledge, was when I finally started to see my own work open up in a way that was intellectually gratifying for me, first and foremost, right? You can get a recipe for anything on the internet. You don't need me to put it between the covers of a book. But I think that tapestry, that texture is what interests me in other people's writing as well, in yours, as as a matter of example. And so I really wanted to give context to also some recipes and some food history and culture that I wasn't seeing on TV, and that I certainly wasn't seeing in magazines and in media. And a lot of times wasn't even seeing on PBS, to be honest. You know, I grew up with Julia Child, I grew up with Graham Kerr, I grew up with even, you know, the Frugal Gourmet and how he would cook recipes from different countries. But I didn't really see my experience until I saw Mother Joffrey, you know, on TV in the 80s. And those programs were in England. And I grew up in America. So I learned about them because I was Indian and we were all so proud of her. But I wanted to give voice to the immigrant experiences that I was having and in the communities that I grew up. And so I have luckily found a way to make a living excavating the things that naturally interest me, you know, in food. And I think that has been my greatest triumph, is that I'm able to spin a TV show out of what I'd be really doing for free anyway, because it's what I'm into, you know.
I can totally relate to that and to so many things that you said. This horrible idea of imposter syndrome. I cannot tell you, I might have lived with that all the way through the Jemima Code. And those friends that are really intimately close to me, that are part of the transitioning of my nonprofit from an organization that had to have somebody else's name on it, right? I always worked for a newspaper or book publisher, or, you know, built a nonprofit on the name of something else. But I was constantly self-effacing. And there, I say that often, that it's because I'm a journalist, but it's not just that, you know, it's also this pressure that I think we feel as women. You hit on so many high notes that I want to get to Sandra about. This idea that the labels are barriers for us. You know, if you don't fit into one of these boxes, I wasn't a scholar, I wasn't a chef, I wasn't an editor, like I didn't fit any of those things. And so the industry is just like, they don't know what to do with us. And so we're pigeonholed, our work is pigeonholed. And in order to climb out, what's interesting is that the antidote to that is to be as authentic as you can possibly be. Right. That at this point you feel, I think I felt like, what have I got to lose? They won't accept me anyway. So I'm just going to go for it and be who I am and tell the truth to the extent that I can. And so, Sandra, I know that you've got some of those similar barriers and issues that you've overcome as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in the industry and what women can take from that?
Yes, I have found a lot of parallels in what both of you are saying, and in what Padma, you said, having the imposter syndrome. I also had that, to the point that I was the first Latin American writer to head a cooking column in North Carolina, in the South of the United States, back in the 1990s. And when I was first hired to do this column, my editor got a phone call from a very, very angry reader saying, "How dare you give our Southern cooking column to a Mexican?" And I always say, it offended me twice, double. I love Mexicans, but I'm not Mexican. My family's from Guatemala. So it's like, wait a minute. And secondly, because I knew that they were not referring to the term Mexican in a positive way, but they were already boxing us as an inferior group of people. So I had two choices: either to get super offended and leave, or to say, you know, let me convince this reader that I'm worthy of the column and let me change her mind. And if I can do this, then we're home free. And at the beginning, I did that column, later became 5 columns for the paper, but I did that whole section at the beginning as a generalist, and I would write about ingredient-based cooking. And all of a sudden I started writing about cookbooks and interviewing celebrities. Emerald was my first big celebrity that I interviewed, you know, and I hosted him when I came here. And I'm getting to that point where my column is being very widely read. And my editor said to me, "So where are all the Latin American cultures you promised me?" And I said, "Well," he said, "you already became a Southern expert. Now I need you to showcase the 21 countries you've been telling me when we sit down and talk about it at the column." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to dare to do it." And it took me about 4.5 years of writing about my Southern culture, my new home, until I felt that I was part of the community and that my community was ready to hear what my second culture was about. So in many ways, it's what Padma, you were saying, you start writing and talking about, oh, I don't have a chef's career. I didn't go, to school to become a chef. I don't have this and the other. And it's not until we come to that sense of our own acceptance, really, that the community accepts us and accepts our expertise as something valuable. And that's when I started writing about Latin American food. And curiously, what happened in this process is that in 1996, while I'm trying to become more of a Southern writer and interviewing readers and talking to members of my community about their food and what they're eating, putting on their tables, I discovered a new food movement. And I was able to name it. I discovered that Southerners were starting to cook with ingredients of 21 Latin American countries, and that this movement was happening under the radar. It wasn't chef driven. It wasn't a fusion cooking that was chef driven. It was a developmental organic movement that was coming from the homes of people, and that was becoming a real new branch of Southern foodways. So I named it the New Southern Latino Movement. And 20 some years later, if I'm aging myself, but 20 some years later, it is now a recognized movement, all over the world as something that exists. So it was incredible to know that I had to go through all of that to be in the right place at the right time to discover a movement that only I could have discovered because of the position that I found myself in. So what I would tell other women is, yes, don't listen to that self-deprecating voice that's telling you you're not good enough, because I don't know what it is about women. We hear that much more than men do. I don't know if it's something that's ingrained in us. I've tried certainly not to let my children believe that, my daughters, but also to say, don't listen to that voice, challenge it instead. Push yourself to show yourself first and then others that you are an expert at something.
I love that.
It is because men have been telling women that all along. They've been saying, historically, we can't own property, we can't inherit property, we can't vote. I mean, everything has been a yes, we can.
Right. And now we can't even control our own bodies, right? That's where we are again, at having that discussion. You both touched on an important element here that's certainly we could make it man focused, but there's also a historical aspect here that has dismissed the role of the home cook and home cooking to really elevate this whole idea of chefs. And again, we're careful to be respectful for Top Chef and all of that, but we love Taste the Nation too. And the value of what happens in the kitchen is not just, the recipe development is certainly happening in the kitchen, and we are all communicating recipes. But there are other qualities, there are other virtues that happen around the table, especially when you get women together talking around the table. The conversations always steer in the way that we're kind of going now tonight. And I'm wondering, Padma, I'm going to ask you both. I'm wondering if there's a mentor, if there's somebody, you mentioned Mater, and did you have a personal relationship with her, or did you just look up to her? Because the option that I had, I was bombarded with the imagery of the Aunt Jemima character. And so for me, it was hard to find that, that mentorship beyond my community.
Yeah, I mean, Mother is somewhat of a mentor to me now, I didn't find out about Mother until, I was already in college. And I didn't grow, as I said, I knew about her programs, but I didn't grow up watching them because they ran in England mostly. And I think they may have run in America, but I was in Italy by then. But and I have a relationship, I know her now, but I didn't have any mentors. And, regarding your earlier comment about Top Chef, like Top Chef is about professional chefs. It's about the analysis of food and the execution of 100 plates all hot. It's about restaurant food. Let's be clear about that. Yeah. And that's a highly specialized show. And I'm very proud of, the legacy of Top Chef, but it's, not really what I do. I host the show, but I am not a chef. But for me, like the cooking at home has been poo-pooed, and I'll tell you why. I'll get off my soapbox in a second, but it is a function of the patriarchy that most commerce and business in our society is handled by men because it involves money. And the professional restaurant business is the sale of food for money. And because it's commerce, men have controlled it like every other professional field in our culture for millennia. Most of the cooking in the world is actually done by women and female hands.
Yes.
And so you know, that also tells you all you need to know about why home cooking has been downgraded in the pantheon or hierarchy of, you know, quote unquote, what's important in our food culture. But the food made at home far outnumbers the food just by weight, you know, far outnumbers the food made in restaurants. So actually the world is being fed at home. And to me, that is of colossal importance and interest and merits, you know, a lot of scholarship and also respect. I mean, that's what fascinates me. And that's why Taste the Nation, you know, my two shows are such opposite ends of the spectrum. And we do, of course, feature chefs on Taste the Nation too. But I think that food in a way and where it comes from and its connection to all these other tentacles of our culture, including history, including agriculture, including politics, including ethnicities and cultural history, all of that is kept by food writers and is kept by oral histories that are passed on through generations. And so the study of that and the fact of just keeping those stories alive, that to me is what really interests me. And I think that is what tells us also who we are as people. And so, you know, as women have traditionally also been the ones to raise the children in a community, they've also done that through food, and food becomes such a vehicle for passing on identity too.
Absolutely.
So to me, all that stuff is really compelling and really important. And I'm just really glad that I can kind of take part in that, you know?
I think what's really exciting right now is that those gatekeepers aren't keeping all of the gates closed anymore, because there's so many platforms and so many opportunities that there's a voracious appetite for these kinds of stories. For us, suddenly, we were the ones that nobody wanted to hear from, really. And now we're the ones that are leading the charge to tell more stories. People are pursuing us to tell those stories. And so I'm really excited about where we're headed, and training and encouraging and inspiring more young women, more women who haven't thought about entering the field. Sandra, you were so good in our last visit to point out that this isn't just about young women, right? That there are women that come into the industry with a full identity that are older. So tell us a little bit about the mentorship in your world. And I know you've got some, well, I'll let you tell us a little bit about your mentor.
Like Padma, I didn't have mentors starting my career. It was very lonely at the beginning. I was the only Latina in town, in the deep South, you know, still very culturally permeated by the Anglos, the white and black. Let's say South was white and black. There was no in between. So I did not know where to go. So it was, I like to say, it was the best schooling I could have had. I had to learn as I was going. However, and this is one of the reasons, Toni, that I was talking to you about also including women and not falling into the ageism of just selecting young voices, but also older, more secure voices, if you will, is that when I finally had a mentor, my first mentor, it was about 20 years into my career, was Jean Anderson. And Jean Anderson is a wonderful food writer. She doesn't like TV. She doesn't like to be on the spotlight, but she is I think, as pivotal as Marcella Hassan and Julia Child and Madhur Jaffrey, women who really have schooled us and written through the written word and introduced all of these techniques to the home cook. And so we would go on field trips, we will do a lot of these things, but she was a champion of my work. And she kept saying, you're doing the real work. Keep on doing and following your heart and doing the real thing. And don't forget never to cut corners, always to test your recipes, always to follow your sources so you can find those sources that are real, never to fall onto the people that are telling you that first story that you probably heard 3,000 times, like, in the South, everybody ate cowpeas because they thought they were fodder for cows. That's not what happened. The real story is completely different, and I wrote about it in one of my books if you want to find out more. But it is important, for us to celebrate the fact that it has been women who have farmed the land, that have fed our generations of people, and who really own the treasures of traditional cooking, upon which all chefs have built their cuisines. And I think Julia did that. She brought French home cooking to the Americas, but she didn't do it as a chef. She brought it from a home cook to another home cook. And I think that's what we're all trying to do. And Toni, many times during our years of friendship, I've heard you talk about how you rescue so many of the books of your ancestors. And that has inspired me to think of myself as rescuing the recipes that are being lost for generations, not only within the United States, but within Latin America, because we have 21 different countries and none two cuisines are the same. And even though here in the States you come and they want us to check a Latino box, we're not all Latino Americans when we go to Latin America. You're either Nicaraguan, Salvadorian, Guatemalan, Colombian, etc. We're still very much divided by country, and we want it to be that way. We're proud of our history, we're proud of our cuisines. And so I find another important mentor for me was Natalie Dupree, and is Natalie Dupree. And she, again, the queen of Southern cooking, she was a staunch defender of my work when I wrote the New Southern Latino Table, in saying, this is a real movement. She's just ahead of her time, but you watch her. This is a real movement. When others were saying, oh, we think this is a fad, she said, no. She's found something that's real. And to this day, we remain very, very wonderful friends. And I love her for it. And I really will never be grateful enough, which makes it important for me, my generation, to become mentors for the women who follow. Because it is impossible for one person, at least for one person in Latin America, to pretend to be the sole caretaker and the sole owner of a cuisine. My work can only accomplish a little bit in what is the ocean of knowledge that exists in Latin America. So my job as a writer is to introduce new things, but as a mentor, it is to introduce other voices, to join so that we can build a complete story, and a story that will continue to develop as food continues to flux into the future.
Oh, I just love that. And of course, Natalie is a mentor of mine as well. And she offered that same generosity to me, trying to, I think, share her platform. She used her platform to make sure that I was welcomed and received in places where we would be at food gatherings. And it was very close to someone asking me to get them a drink, because I had on a white blouse and black slacks or something. Yeah, it was bad. So
I wish I had a mentor. I would have killed for a mentor to, even just bounce ideas off of. I mean, I made it my mission now to actually mentor 2 or 3, at any given time. I have just a small handful of young women of color in food that I've been kind of keeping in touch with, because I wish I had that, so that all the pain and struggle and learning things the hard way that I have to do, at least like somebody else can be the benefactor of that, so that they don't have to learn everything like this,
Absolutely.
Somebody can say, no, it's actually like this.
Well, I think you guys are bringing up an interesting point here, that we want to share our knowledge and our experiences. And sometimes it can also seem like maybe the next generation doesn't really think we have that much that we can share, because the industry is changing so fast, and the opportunities for delivering content have changed so much, right? And so if we're constantly talking about the struggles of penetrating the publishing world or getting onto television, like they don't have any of those struggles now. They can just, if you've got a camera and an internet connection, you can become, you know, a celebrity chef. You can have your own book. You can, you know, like they can do all of those things. I hear you. I know that's where we're headed. But, you know, so the question for me in gathering a community of strong, supportive women, thought leaders in our industry to help me shepherd this Julia Child Award, the grant, and what we should do with it. I could have just donated it to one of the chef organizations and it fed hungry people. But I really had some wise counsel from close women who talked to me about the importance of this legacy that we're all talking about, that there are important values that we have to share. It's not just old news, what we've accomplished, but there are some kernels of advice and counsel in we could give master classes. Like, I'm just going to claim that, right? Stake the claim for that. And as you said, Padma, wishing that someone had been there, a mentor for you. So when we think about bridging this gap with people that have been primarily trained on the internet, where recipes are a dime a dozen, where people aren't really focused on recipe development and the strictures associated with that, making sure that process is clear and methods are concise and transferable. Like, there's so many variables that go into not just food writing, but also to recipe development when you're talking about publishing cookbooks or being on television cooking in front of a camera. What do you think about that? Do you think that we are dinosaurs? Is there value for us to keep talking?
Like Julia Child, I was a late bloomer. You know, I have had a couple of careers, and I did not, really become involved in food in any other way besides cooking it in my own house for my loved ones until I was in my 30s. You know, I was 29 when I published that first cookbook, and it was, I was just sort of flying by the seat of my pants. And I think, yes, look, there are always smaller cameras and accessibility to publishing your work, but it doesn't change the importance of knowing what the hell you're talking about, first of all, to speak plainly, if I may. But also, there are things like that women should just share. I always joke that there's an old boys network. I want to make an old broads network.
Me too.
Let's do it.
And so there's so much stuff, like even, with one of these young women that I was mentoring, she had a business, she was doing stuff. I was helping her navigate through press, and she even got a show. And then I looked at her contract and I was like, you can't sign this. Tell that network that I am an investor in your business and that they should send those papers to my attorney, who is now going to be your attorney. And, I called up my attorney and I said, hey, can you do me a favor? You can just look over this, and, she should just have basic things, like whenever she's on camera, they're paying her peanuts. They should at least say the name of her candy company so she gets something out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And little things like that I didn't know to ask for either, and other people did, and if you've ever watched Top Chef, I'm saying everybody's name of everyone's restaurant or product or everything except my own cookbooks. It's because I didn't know to negotiate that, and I want this other young woman not to make the same mistake. But I think beyond that, it's really important, because if you let's take, this beautiful idea that you have, which I am so not surprised by, because you're such an intelligent thinker and such a smart woman, that it's a great thing to do. Julia Child, the namesake of this award, didn't get on TV until she was in her 50s, okay? And she had to constantly advocate for herself, even when PBS was trying to edge her out after she'd been on and really revamped the whole national public broadcasting system, starting with WGBH in Boston. And then they were trying to edge her out after, you know, several years of bringing them all this exposure, really,
Right.
and being on the
and
cover of
money.
People, on the cover of Time, you know, all this stuff. They were trying to edge her out because she was getting old and pushing 60 instead of 50. And so she, again, had to advocate for herself and go to Good Morning America. And, you know, that's how she wrote Volume 2, because there was interest in it again because of that. And so I think, you know, I think we all have something to contribute. And I would really like to use, you know, your fabulous idea as a receptacle for all of the information that we each can bring to that receptacle, you know, that this thing that you want to create, and have it be a bank of information so that the next generation has a wealth of information, but also doesn't have to go through the bullshit that we did. Sorry, I know it's the
Absolutely.
Smithsonian, so you can beat me out if you want to, but there's no other word for it sometimes.
There isn't.
You know?
You're absolutely right.
I would like to add that in Spanish, we have a saying that goes, más sabe el diablo por diablo que por viejo, which means the devil knows more because he's old, not because he's the devil. And I think it's really important. Again,
That's a great saying.
isn't that a great saying? We bring this wealth of experience and information that has taken us years to hone, to research, to develop. Why is it that they replace us or want to replace us so quickly with younger people? It's not an ageism thing. It is a matter of experience, and again, of bringing respect to us who are going to be their ancestors at some point. The way that we are trying to bring respect and to maintain and rescue our ancestors' voices. In our case, through the kitchen. In our case, through the cultural and anthropological and sociological issues that happen at our family tables for generations and generations before we got here. I think people forget that there is a lot of power in food. We don't only talk about eating for flavor. In many of the cases of our ancestors and our generations, power, politics, religion, sex, everything happened centered around food, the control, who had control. And when I teach young women who want to be food writers, and I say to them, you know, there's this stigma that young women shouldn't want to be in the kitchen anymore because it's not cool to be in the kitchen.
It's not sexy.
It's not the coolest thing to do, not sexy. You know, it's the most powerful place for a woman to be is in the kitchen. As a woman, you get to decide where the money of that house goes, who you give that money to. Are you giving it to people who are poisoning you with all sorts of chemicals? Or are you giving it to the farmers who are growing your food in an ecological way, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, there is power in food. There is power in preserving recipes, in serving a good dish of beans and rice and knowing where the history of that particular dish came from and being able to teach your kids so they can feel proud the next time they make a plate of rice and beans for somebody that looks down upon them. You know, there's so much more that needs to be saved in foodways that we've been able to do because we have, first of all, broken the mold. Not being afraid. Maybe we've been really afraid. We've just been very, very stubborn and still gone against the crowd who told us we couldn't do something. And just now are able to say, you know, with expertise and without fear, without so much of that imposter syndrome, this is how things are. This is the truth. This is how it developed. Take it or leave it. You know, and I think that's important for us as women. We're not used to that. We're not used to just being able to say, take us as we are and take it or leave it. Men don't like that, but that's the new woman. That's who we now are.
I love that. I love that. And I don't think that I can go any further after that. Like you have just hammered home the whole ambition behind this project. Our goal is to, I've been jokingly saying that we have binders full of women. And so I am gathering along with a committee of women bios on every single one of us that you can think of. And so anyone listening, we need to know who the important women are in your communities. And we need to, we're going to develop a dossier and just sort of determine what kind of categories we should be talking about. We've touched on some of them here tonight. We've talked about researching. We've talked about being our authentic selves, not being confined by labels put on us by other people. We've talked about extending a hand of friendship to one another, which I think, if I'm going to be brutally frank, I think that there is a lot of conversation about how women lead the charge and women run households and all of that, but sometimes we aren't as good to each other as we could be. And I also think that that's based on the industry and the society in which we live. Padma, you know, I whispered to you at a beard event one time, I want a television show. And you said, well, go over there and talk to da-da-da-da. Like, you didn't say, give me, you know, some hokey answer to keep me from becoming your competition or excluding me. You were generous and made sure that I knew who the just right producer was to talk to, and I won't forget that. So I think that there is a part of this that is about professionalism, and there certainly is that. But another part of this is about mentorship and uplifting the next generation. Every time I see you with Little Hands, and now this children's book, Sandra, the relationships that you have with your daughters, and my work now at Cook's Country to take the messaging that was centralized on African Americans, but now is going to be overturning every stone, as Edna Lewis said to me, to tell these stories of all cooks in America. I think we're on the way with something here. I'm really excited about it, and I cannot wait for us to take the first step. We're hoping maybe spring. We're working on a new website. The grant will allow us to do that. We're also going to pay women a fair wage. Let's say you guys put up a video for us. I want you to be paid. Like, I can't pay you a lot. So maybe we don't know whether there's going to be, we don't want a membership fee because we don't want to create another barrier to access.
Right.
You know, we don't want to do that. So we want the services to be free, not like taking a master class, but we also want you to be paid for your time. So does that mean that people pay $1 every time they listen to you, like, you know, a download on your iPhone? And then you guys get the $1? Like, it seems small, but it is also the gesture that says, I respect you. We appreciate your effort and your time, especially we do tonight. All of you agreed to come on for this inaugural gathering and just see how it goes without any expectations. And I just really, really appreciate you all for that. So I am so grateful that you guys came to join me tonight to brainstorm about the future, to look forward to the possibilities for what we can do as women for the culture, for the community, for each other. And I look forward to our next steps, hopefully getting you on screen again in the spring. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful to talk to both of you. Really great role models.
Thank you. And Toni, anytime you want to talk to me about television, you can just ring up the phone and get me if you need anything. I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Okay, take care, guys.
You love
Bye.
you.
Bye, love you, bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us today. We want to thank Toni, Alelia, Padma, and Sandra for this important, inspiring, and timely discussion. If you enjoyed today's events, please consider signing up for our food history newsletter to get the latest updates and information about our research, collecting, exhibitions, and public programming. You can find the URL in the description below. Thank you again, and be well.